Greetings, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Adrienne Brown. I serve on the California Community College's Board of Governors, and I'm also an LACCD District Academic Senate Professional Development Coordinator. And today I'm here in that capacity to welcome you all to this wonderful event being hosted by the Sustainable Environment Institute. The goal of the state or the vision of the Sustainable Environment Institute is to advance the principles of sustainable living through teaching, practice, and community participation, in the belief that the application of these principles will lead to an enduring and more equitable society. Today's particular session is climate anxiety, fear, and hope. We have all these different feelings. I saw a recent headline that said the North Pacific gray whale population is now considered healthy. And that definitely was encouraging for me to read. But we see oftentimes headlines that make us feel other ways. So we're going to be going over that today, how that impacts us in all of society, what we can do about it, and hopefully we'll all leave with more hope and less act. I will pass it along to George Letty and Beth Abels to continue to give you more details about today's presentation.
Well, thank you, Adrienne. As Adrienne just mentioned, this is actually part of an ongoing series of seminars hosted by the Sustainable Environment Institute of the LA Community College District. And we're very grateful to the Professional Development College for having come up with this idea some years back. And we've kept this alive and well for years, even through COVID. We've presented a series. This is the second one in the year 2024. Our first one was in February, and this is the second time we visit the issue of climate anxiety, which we looked at in November of 2022. And I'm happy to say that then we also had as a guest Eugenie Lewis, who's with us again today, along with her colleague and friend Trevor Lehmann, who is in a sense dropping in from Canada, who's both have a practice in psychology and in climate action. They bridge or straddle those two worlds of the various things that impinge on and cause anxiety with young people. That means our students, and how much of that has to do with environmental decline and the overall threat of the climate crisis. So it is a unique practice, but I will share with you as an introduction before our guests take over some minor introductory material. So to that end, I'm going to visit.
George, I'm going to interrupt you for 1 second. I'm sorry, Beth Abels here. We may be going till there's a lot of information, so I wanted to warn folks that there's a possibility we might be going till 1:15. If you have to go, of course, you have to go. Please don't hesitate. And I'm sorry if you're scheduled it and this will be frustrating for you, but we realize we have more info than we can smash into an hour. So just a heads up. And if you are signed up here through the VRC for Flex Credit, please make sure that the name that shows up on your camera is the same name you signed up for in the VRC, so we can make sure you get credit. Sorry. Thanks, George. I'll be quiet.
No, thank you, Beth. She said, remember to mention people are being recorded. Remember to use your real names and let them know we'll go over. And I wrote it down right in front of me and then went on to skip that. Thank you, Beth. That's very important introductory material there. So I'm just sharing with you here what is, of course, the flyer for today's event. We're happy to have Trevor Lehmann and Eugenie Lewis, and they will talk to us about how to feel empowered through activism in otherwise vexing and formidable obstacle of anxiety from knowing that the climate is in crisis. This is Flex Credit is available, of course, for faculty, and that's why we ask faculty to log in through the Flex Credit link on the poster. The upcoming for Earth Month, which is incredibly active, I think our events calendar has never had more items on it than April. And we will be collaborating ideally and presenting a film festival, as well as working with the California Center for Climate Education at West LA College on April 25th. And then on May 16th, we'll have embedding climate literacy in the curriculum, which is the ongoing a project, you could almost say central mission at this point of the Sustainable Environment Institute to make sure that the climate curriculum gets somehow infused in all disciplines and courses throughout the district, to the extent that, in fact, I'm happy to say that we have not just Eugenie Lewis here, but also Lucy Garcia, and they've been quite successful in doing that in the LA USD. So Trevor Lehmann has a master's in counseling psychology and is the chair of Climate Informed Counselors. It's a chapter of the Canadian Counseling Psychotherapy Association, and a career consultant with the University of Manitoba. There is a link on this slide, and you can visit his publications and previous projects that he undergoes also as a consultant, as a career consultant. And so that would be this site here. And Eugenie Lewis is a licensed social worker and a climate activist. Her practice includes global career and development facilitator. So she is available in that capacity with both individual basis and small groups, mentoring people of all ages and stages of life to discover and fulfill life's passions.
This summer, millions of Americans are experiencing firsthand the effects of climate change. Triple-digit temperatures for days on end, smoke from record-setting wildfires fouling the air, warming oceans, bleaching coral reefs. Opinion polls find growing concern about climate change. Psychologists say that can be a positive thing, spurring people to action. But for some people, it becomes an overwhelming sense of despair or anxiety. Psychologists call it climate anxiety.
I feel very anxious about the state of the climate and our future. I believe that if we don't make necessary changes now, we will be changed in the future in ways that we do not want and cannot control and will not be able to mitigate. The moment when I realized that the climate change crisis was causing anxiety in my life was the day when the sky in the San Francisco Bay Area was orange. That is not the color of the sky, and that had a profound and deep effect on me because it so clearly showed that the danger was real.
I'm worried because this is all we have right now. We talk about going to the moon and Mars, but this is what we have. I think I'm more worried maybe than anxious at this point.
The voices of Americans and how climate change is affecting their feelings. Leslie Davenport is a climate psychology therapist. She teaches at the California Institute of Integral Studies and is author of Emotional Resiliency in the Era of Climate Change. Leslie, when does healthy concern about the planet, about climate change, become this sort of climate anxiety?
Well, from the emerging field of climate psychology, one thing that's really important to understand is we view distress, upset, sadness, grief, anger about climate change to be a really reasonable, even healthy reaction, because it's built into us as people that if we feel risks, threats, experience losses, there's going to be upset. So it's really important to acknowledge that if you're feeling that on any level of intensity, it really means you're paying attention, you care, you're empathetic to what's happening to our world.
If someone thinks they have sort of almost crippling climate anxiety, how do they find someone who can help them?
I would really recommend what's being called the Climate Aware Therapist Directory. Since this training, again, is not built in yet to the mental health field, there are some therapists who have chosen to have this as a specialization.
Climate psychology therapist Leslie Davenport, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So it's important to avail ourselves of the resources, and the SEI does a big effort to maintain some curated sources on climate anxiety, and climate change. Our own Zhao Bellenhorf, who is away today, she's in China, she has prepared through the LA Valley College Library a whole set of web pages on climate anxiety that have resources for both faculty and students. And that is actually featured on the homepage of the website that is right behind me, seilaccd.net. Our lecture series then today, this is what I've put up on the website that will include a recording of this event in addition to the articles that you see listed underneath that. We've now created a climate anxiety page because we've accumulated enough material to do that. And we do that when we have a sort of specialized topic. So the crisis in mental health does in fact come to reacting to an abnormal situation. And I need to do something constructive in such a crisis is what psychologists and practicing counselors like our guests today are doing with their professional work. It is, in fact, keeping therapists up at night. All of these articles are from, reputable sources, and they're all posted on our website. The generation that perhaps has been the most affected by both COVID and the climate crisis is the generation that is now being called Generation Z or Generation Z. It is, in fact, a hallmark of a lot of what they're confronting, even in making their decisions around college degrees. Even should I even go to college? A lot of young people are asking themselves, what's the point of going to college? And the answer is to study the environment, of course. So combating doomerism is, in fact, a theme that you'll find. This is a wonderful TED Talk that will dislodge you from any complacency, and it's a very inspiring TED Talk. And to really ask ourselves, in a sense, existential questions. One could flip the situation around, as some young people are doing, and saying there's never been a more interesting time to be alive. That can be a curse, but a more important time for whatever we do to have long-lasting consequences. And that is why you see a lot of activism around climate with Generation Z. And it is meaningful and even therapeutic. It dislodges us from our sense of isolation, loneliness, and despair. And I think that we can really take a hint from young people who are quite active around the issues of the loss of biodiversity, extinction, climate, and their own futures. So I found this particular set of articles, The Joy of Saving the World, and it flips the entire crisis mentality on its head and shows you to what extent it is in some ways liberating to know that you're dealing with the most vexing and formidable problem the species has probably ever faced in all of our history. So with that, I want to stop the share and allow our guests to I'll pass it to Eugenie Lewis, who is going to start the ball rolling. And thank you, Eugenie and Trevor, for your participation today.
Oh, first of all, hello, everyone. I was to unmute myself. I'm happy to be here with you and presenting along with my friend and colleague, Trevor Lehmann. I'm so happy he was able to participate in this as an expert in climate anxiety. I'm a therapist. I'm a career and college counselor. I'm a youth mental health advocate. I work with I'm on the advisory board with the Department of Mental Health, advocating for youth mental health. And I'm also a climate activist. And I just want to share briefly my climate story, which really started with my own children, and who had shared with me several years ago how concerned they were about their future and the future of the planet. And I think I had thought for some time about becoming involved with climate activism, but that really spurred me to say, I'm going to do everything in my power to address this, to create a future for youth. So I wanted to kind of start by presenting some context, I think, around youth mental health as someone that works with youth. Both in terms of just the backdrop of mental health issues that youth are facing, and then the added layer of climate change and other world situations. So let's see, how do I move forward? Trying to forward my screen. Oh, there we go. So I just maybe start with, in 2021, our Surgeon General Vivek Murthy, he pronounced a youth mental health crisis and attributed this to academic pressures, childhood traumas, we sometimes call them adverse childhood events, negative psychological effect of social media, which we keep hearing about, alcohol and substance use, which sometimes is, a way for people to cope with difficult situations. And then what we're talking about today, societal issues such as income inequality, racism, gun violence, and climate change. So I'm pointing this out because climate change is one of many things that is layered on top of what youth are going through. Some of the data on youth mental health is kind of startling, and in 2021, there was the Centers for Disease Control had a survey, and they identified that 4 out of 10 students felt persistently sad or hopeless, and that 1 out of 5 had seriously considered suicide, and 1 out of 10 had attempted suicide. And then for young adults, a report by Harvard Graduate School of Education identified youth or young people, maybe a little bit older young people, lacking meaning and purpose and direction, having financial worries and achievement pressures, a perception that the world is unraveling, relationship difficulties, and social and political pressures. So I see that there are a lot of personal concerns that young people are facing. They're trying to develop their own lives and a healthy identity. They have sometimes mental health concerns. COVID still has some lingering impact on people. It created an impediment sometimes to social relationships and academic deficiencies that sometimes are challenging to be made up. Young people are trying to build partnerships and close relationships. They have financial concerns about like the cost of college. Sometimes even, family stressors, their parents are stressed or their caregivers are stressed. They have health concerns. There's pressure in school, the cost of college, I mentioned that, and somewhat of an uncertain job market. Some people are worried like, oh, AI, is that going to take my career away? So these are personal things. And then we have the world situation, which, the school violence, the feeling of maybe not feeling safe all the time, even climate, you worry like, oh, is there going to be some kind of environmental thing that happens and it will affect even my community with like heavy rainfall or flooding or, fires and that kind of thing. We have racial injustices, and there's a backlash against diversity, equity, and inclusion. It seems that we have a hostile environment for LGBTQ communities. We have the war in Gaza and Ukraine. A lot of young people are very concerned about these wars and the resolution and the inhumanity that is faced with what people are experiencing. A contentious political environment, and then of course, climate change. So I'd like to focus on some of the factors that shape youth development, and these are on the individual, the family, the community, and the environment that we live in and society. And all of these shape who we are, who young people are. I also am a big advocate for positive youth development and the need to develop our, assets of youth and have people develop a positive identity and be able to contribute to society. A lot of youth I meet really do want to make a difference. They want something meaningful and they would like to help other people. But we need supportive environments for youth to make sure that they are successful and having a path forward. Several years ago, when COVID was here, it's still here, I know, but I did some workshops on resilience and how we can be resilient when we're facing adversity. And there were kind of a series of factors. I think I was looking into, kind of the research on resilience, but things like how we can have purpose in our lives, how we can, develop our coping skills and thinking skills, our taking care of ourselves, how we take care of ourselves. And of course, having a sense of community is really vital. And I think a lot of people during COVID were very lonely. And I noticed that our Surgeon General points out a lot of people had loneliness. And so I think we need community very much. So I think it's very important for us to develop our resilience skills in the face of climate change. And this is a framework, and I have to apologize because it may be kind of a busy, but I was trying to create 3 major pathways for developing climate resilience. One is personal, which is just kind of self-care, having a supportive community, having safe places to go. Like, for example, in college, to have, you know, at least 3 places at school where you can go to get support and that you feel like you're safe and there are people, adults or people there that can help you. And then career is another pathway, career and education. I'm a big advocate for, climate literacy. I think people need to develop skills and expertise first to understand the climate crisis, to understand maybe how they can contribute to through their careers in climate solutions, to have opportunities to, mentorship, maybe role models in the climate world. I know here, the SEI is a leader in promoting climate education in college and community college and in college in general. And we at the Climate Reality Project have been working on climate literacy for K through 12. I think it's important to have a path that you can see forward. You can see like how I can move forward in my life. What's the next step? And have a supportive community to do that. Climate empowerment, and that's what a lot of what I and Trevor are going to be sharing, but to have the balance between the knowledge of the problems with the balance of solutions. And, so you don't feel so overwhelmed that it's just unsolvable, that we can look at the solutions that are developing, that already exist. I think it's very important to have a climate community, people you can talk to, people that you can advocate with, be part of a team to work. I'm also have a public health background. I always think it's nice if you're like to have a campaign that you're working on together. You have a purpose and a goal that you're trying to achieve, and it also can create an opportunity to talk to each other and understand, the stress of climate change. And then knowing how to take action. I think this is important that we have, a lot of people say they don't really know what to do. And there are many things to do. And I think it's just a matter of finding what skill sets you want to use and where what your priorities are, whether it's biodiversity or, focusing on renewable energy, whatever area you feel passionate about. But I think giving people tangible things they can do. And then these are just kind of general things that educators can do to support climate literacy and create a supportive environment for students. If you do notice that your students are having, mental health challenges, to help them get support, and use a trauma-informed approach, which means that you look below the surface and that you understand that a lot of people are facing a lot of different challenges. And then youth, taking care of yourself and building your community, holding a vision of hope for the future. I think hope is absolutely essential. I know Trevor is going to be talking about this, but to be able to visualize a future that is different than what we might see now, to focus on solutions, to be able to take action and talk and cultivate your creativity, and perhaps find a job that's focused on climate or incorporate that into your career. And I just have put together a couple of resources. Some of them are self-care resources here, and also how you can access mental health and community resources. So with that, I'd like to introduce my friend Trevor Lehmann. We met several years ago with the common interest of both career development and climate activism. And he's been a wonderful friend. And I was part of a book club with him on climate anxiety, which really kind of launched my interest in this area. So at this point, I would like to turn it over to Trevor. And I will stop sharing my screen.
Perfect. I'm just going to take over sharing here. Thanks for everyone coming out, sharing space with me today. Please excuse the glasses. The particulars of my condition require I look like Elton John. Oh, can you not hear me? Anyone?
Or you're not on mute.
Yeah.
Hear you. We can hear
Perfect. Yeah, okay. So the particulars of my condition require I look like Elton John at all times. It's good to see you all. I'm hoping today to share some.
Hear you, Trevor.
Sorry?
Jeannie, we can hear him.
Yeah, I think everybody can hear me. Maybe there's something on your end, Jeannie. But I appreciate it. Okay, cool. So what are we doing here? So I'm gonna go through some stuff that I hope will be useful to you. As this, you might have known, climate change, big topic, lots of stuff going on. Oh, my computer is taking my order more like a suggestion. Give me one moment here. I have to, it's doing something with dual screens. So please excuse me for just a second here. Okay, we got this. We got this. Sorry. COVID has drastically improved my ability to do these computers, but sometimes it still throws me a curveball. Okay.
Trevor, can you hear me? Somehow your speaker isn't working.
I can hear you loud and clear, Jeannie.
Jeannie, I can hear him loud and clear. I think others can't. Maybe they can raise their hand and say if they can or can't.
We can hear him. So I think it's Jeannie.
Okay. Appreciate establishing this. I once did a conference at a palliative care conference on the meaning of life, got 40 minutes in and they're like, your microphone's off. And I'm like, thank you. Thank you. Really appreciate it. We were only talking about the meaning of life, nothing important. So glad you're checking in on me, Jeannie. I appreciate it. But I'm seeing from people that it seems like the theme is that generally people can hear me. Okay, so we're gonna go through this. It's gonna be great. I just have to make sure this is all running. Okay. Okay. So now for the second test, can people see the slideshow?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. So I'm going to just jump ahead of introductions but I'm happy to have a Q&A afterwards just so to see where people are at. A little bit about me. I broadly speaking tell people I'm a life transitions guy. So I have a master's in counseling. I focus a lot on helping young and adult people in university age and above, kind of figure out what they want to do in their future and what that looks like. I've also worked in the hospitals and as a grief counselor and palliative counselor, sitting with people at the end of their life, helping them accept the decision. So I say I help people make life choices and I help people accept the choices they've made, broadly speaking. I also look at climate psychology. I run a chapter of therapists, or I collaborate with a chapter of therapists and chair their groups that do a lot of training with counselors on how to better support our clients during these tumultuous times. And kind of a through line through all these things is the idea of hope and I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means because that term gets thrown around a lot and it can be a little bit contextual, but I'm going to say that really this idea that the future could be as good or better than the present is really going to be what we're looking at here. So we're going to talk a little bit about some sensitive topics here. So again, and Jeannie's been talking about some of this stuff as well, but just as a heads up, we are talking about some fairly heavy things. You might have heard some of these terms: eco-anxiety, climate grief, guilt. There's the idea of trauma that climate concerns can often be a force multiplier to other mental health issues. It can have a compounding effect. I used to do Red Cross work, and getting hit by a disaster can exacerbate other mental health challenges. So I don't want to, while there is the climate concerns that can come up, I also don't want to treat people like they're exclusively that. Often other problem challenges in your life get exacerbated by this. Now, this is a new area of research. So you are seeing a lot of different models out here, and there is people kind of actively researching this So you can go out there and find a lot of different models. One that I like, and don't worry, you don't need to memorize this. I won't quiz you at the end. Won't affect your GPA. Is one by Picala, which really came out at the end of 2022. And he takes a model that I kind of align with a bit because he drew on grief counseling theories to help shape and inform some of the ideas. Particularly this idea of what they call the dual processing model, which happens to kind of have this idea of you kind of alternate between processing emotions and doing other things. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but I don't want to I could spend hours talking about that. But broadly speaking, the idea here is that people come towards sort of a gradual awareness of environmental challenges, and then they have some type of inciting event. For some people, it was seeing Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth. For others, it's a forest fire. It can be a large or small event, but there's often this shock that then leads to growing concern and action. And this is sort of different than, it used to be sort of this idea that denial would be the initial thing, but often that sometimes denial or developing kind of alternative theories of how the world works can kind of come as a way of managing this shock in different ways, is sort of what the theory is saying. So when you get this concern, then you often end up spreading, you can experience anxiety and depression, but you can also manage it through kind of a combination of action, grieving, and distancing. So the idea that if you just do 100% action and you don't, but without, the insight, introspection, or just doing things that are personally enjoyable, that you can emphasizing any one of these too much in the absence of the others can kind of lead to real challenges. Additionally, I like this model a bit because it kind of looks at climate as an ongoing thing rather than a thing we fix. And I think in grief, we often see it similarly, where when people go through the loss of a loved one, it's not like, okay, 3 sessions, we're gonna fix this. Like it's an ongoing identity transformation in a way that you can kind of try to manage that experience. Again, this is an area of new research, and the researchers themselves are like, it would be great if people test these theories out more. But I do want to acknowledge that I think I'm surrounded by a lot of people with a lot more training and education in research development. And so if people are looking to try these things out, I would love to see that. But this is one model that I find kind of helpful in this idea of, I see sometimes people emphasizing we got to take action, and I see people being like, we need to process our emotions, and I see some people saying we need to distract ourselves, and I kind of like the idea that we kind of need to do all three to varying degrees, and that where every person lies is going to vary a little bit. In my particular focus, though, is I tend to work a lot in career development, life choices. What do you want to do with your day and your time? There was this idea of this hope gap that came up at one point. It was a term and a turn of phrase from an interview, but I really liked the framing of it, where it sort of says that there were people who are concerned about climate change, climate crisis, but if they didn't know or feel a sense of agency or an empowerment or action that they could take, that it often led to disengagement, fatalism, even some really unhelpful, nihilistic or extreme ways of sort of thinking that could come out of it. So it wasn't so much did people believe in it, but if you didn't know you could do anything, then like it makes sense that you would kind of shut down. So I thought a lot about, well, how do we close that hope gap? And this was then supported by, there's a book, A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety by Sarah Ray. Love this book, recommend it to everybody. Particularly, it was written by a professor teaching environment, and it very much kind of looks at that age graph, demographic. It's excellent for bibliotherapy, or if you just, I always get, when I train therapists, this is one of the books we read. But she had this quote, hope is short-lived unless coupled with a desire for future worlds that are not depressing, but so enticing they might lead us to yearn for a new way of being. And what I like this is, you don't really sell people on penitence very well. Penitence is not like great marketing. You can't be like, if we just suffer a lot, like really, really, if we are willing to make our lives way worse, the future might be brighter maybe. Is not a great way to get people on board. And often when I frame it to people is I'm like, the future could be so much more awesome than the present. Like imagine a world where like we have less discrimination, we have more justice, where I think that this idea of trying to envision a brighter world to try to sell people towards or to move people towards is similar to career development, where usually we'd encourage people towards moving towards stuff they want more rather than away from stuff they don't like, because if that makes sense. Okay, let's talk about hope. So hope has a lot of definitions, but I want to start with a little quick thought experiment. If you think about this, do we hope for things that we know 100% are going to happen? I would argue we don't. You know, I don't go to bed hoping my condo doesn't fly into the atmosphere while I'm sleeping. Like, I'm quite confident it won't. I'm not a physicist, but I'm quite confident that it won't. And I often look at it as, okay, so hope often exists in the spaces of uncertainty. We actually don't know how things are going to turn out, and that is why we hope for them to turn out. So I often try to frame it as hope can only exist when we're dealing with things we don't know what's going to happen. I then talk a little bit about hope that and hope to, or passive and active hope as I call it. This was drawn from Dr. Homer Dixon. He was a political scientist. He studies political conflict and climate change, but he wrote a really good book called Commanding Hope. His website, Commanding Hope, also does a great summary of that book because it is quite lengthy, but I did enjoy it a lot. And I use the terms hope, passive hope, and active hope, but we're going to get into a definition of this in a second here. There is an exercise coming up because I'm very much a show, don't tell kind of person, as much as I do tell, though I do like hearing my own voice too. So there is going to be an exercise that you're going to have to reflect on in a couple of minutes. So if you do have a sheet of paper or Word document, this is just your heads up for that. Passive hope tends to refer to things that we either can't affect directly or we don't want to put resources or time towards adjusting right now. So passive hope could be, I hope that I live in Winnipeg, land of eternal winter, and I could say, I hope that it doesn't snow tomorrow. I have no ability to affect that though. Also, I could say, I hope that we don't do more silica mining. I am not going to put time and energy into trying to adjust silica mining right now. I have too full of a day already, and I'm just, maybe in the future I'll get into that issue, but it's not something I'm going to put in time right now. Active hope are the things we're actively pursuing with our time. And this is important because the climate crisis is often shorthand for like dozens and dozens and dozens of different problems. And it sort of can feel like you're chasing a school of fish when you're trying to kind of deal with all of them. And one thing that often I frame to clients is kind of the idea of, you got to share the glory a little bit. Like you have to leave some stuff for others to work on. And I also tend to frame it as, what do you want to be part of the solution on? Because I think there sometimes is this hero narrative that really puts like, you are the chosen one, you will solve these problems. I'm like, no, you're going to work with a lot of other people to improve these things. So I think that it's often that that idea that, group problems deserve group solutions. So the exercise I'm going to ask everyone to do, and this is going to be you can do this on your own. I'm not asking people to share this with others, but I want you can draw or you can just type two categories, but I want you to imagine two buckets, one with the active hope and one with the passive hope. And I want you to write down the environmental issues and whether you put them in the passive hope bucket right now in your life or the active hope bucket. I'm going to give everyone 2 minutes to do this. Again, normally I spend longer on some of these exercises, but I do want to make sure that I'm delivering value to you and we're getting through content and we leave some time for Q&A. So I'm going to give everyone 2 minutes just to think about this. Again, you don't need to share it with the audience, with everyone else, but this is more for you. Give everyone another minute or so. About 30 more seconds. Hey, how is that for people? Do we need more time? People still doing okay? I use this exercise a lot with clients and people in general just to sort of see where the balance is in your life. Because balance looks different for different people, but I typically find if my clients just stack everything into the active hope bucket, then we're having discussions about like sharing the glory. And maybe there's certain things that it's not saying you're giving up on a problem. It's saying that you're not dedicating time to it at this moment in your life. Like down the road, a few years down the road, you can switch these buckets around anytime you want, but like if the active bucket's overflowing, then maybe that explains why we're feeling a little bit overwhelmed. If likewise the active hope bucket's completely empty and the passive hope bucket has everything there, then maybe we need to think about looking at ways we can engage with the world around us to feel like we're taking, maybe chipping away at one of these problems. Any questions so far? I talk a bit like an auctioneer sometimes, I've been told, so if I'm talking too fast, feel free to get me to repeat anything. I pride myself on my words per minute. Okay, so moving on, I want to talk a little bit about career in general. So often there's this talk about what are the green jobs out there. And for me personally, I tend to kind of take a bit of a counterpoint to that. I think that the idea of treating green jobs like they're this thing that's over here that's separate from the rest of the labor market and the workspace is not the right way to go. I tend to talk about green variations. So most of the jobs out there that are green jobs are variations on other jobs. Counselor is not an inherently green job, but you can make it a green job. And this comes from job crafting as well, from Dutton and Brzezinski, which focuses on the idea of, can you turn your job into, could you be a lawyer who specializes in getting climate refugees over the border? Could you be a carpenter who specializes in green building? Could you be an architect? So again, trying to make it so much, because I know some students come in and they say, I need to study environmental science. And if I can't do physics or chem, I can't help the environment. And I'm like, well, no, you can make your jobs that you're doing take on a more environmental focus to them. Challenge mindset's another one. The idea, sometimes I'll ask students, what type of problem do you want to be part of the solution on, or which problem are you most concerned about? Because people feel obligated to help in a lot of ways, but often trying to get them to build a hierarchy of that can be helpful. This next one is more for one that I get into with other workshops that are more focused on climate justice, but sort of a theory of power and a theory of change, often drawing on lessons we've learned from organized labor and stuff like that. But like, what is your strategy? What are the outcomes? What's the power analysis of how do you create change? And then when it comes to actually narrowing down jobs, often we're talking about your interests, your values, your personality. Normally I can go through these for a long time, but I'm going to give you a couple of quick short exercises that I do. One of the opening questions I often ask people is, what brings you joy? What are the most important day-to-day experiences in your life? What are the most important day-to-day relationships in your life? For anyone who's a Bruce Lee martial arts fan, this is the 1-inch punch. So the most efficient, quick question you can ask people that gets people thinking is just, what brings you joy? What are the most important day-to-day moments? Not that time you climbed Everest, but the day-to-day events. The other thing I sometimes talk about, and this is from Martella, he wrote a really nice little book and journal article on A Wonderful Life. He talks a bit about from self-determination theory, which looks at the idea that people in jobs, no matter where they are, want a sense of autonomy. They want a sense of mastery or building their skills. And they want a sense of relationship and with connection with other people, that they get along with their colleagues. And I sometimes say these are sort of your baselines. Like when people ask, I'm like, no matter what job you're in, I think you probably should be pursuing these things. Another one that I sometimes want is I want people to feel secure in their work. I want people to feel safe in their work. I want people to feel dignity and respect in their work. Decent work is something, again, I can talk about that for hours, but I will say International Labor Organization often talks about what that actually looks like in terms of social protections and personal protections and equity and equality for all in very tangible and direct ways. And then when we really get into the person, the individual, and which is when we're taking more of the psychological focus rather than the systemic focus, there's a number of different exercises you go through. I'm going to make this the one plug, and I'm not going to plug it again, but I do have an online career guide that walks people through all these assessments. I put it together. I call it an imperfect guide to climate and career, kind of get ahead of the criticisms. But what it does is I really combined a number of different assessments and ways of sort of working through self-exploration of interests, values. It's not, you can access it off my website, and it's not a sales funnel. There's nothing behind any walls. I'm not trying to really convince people to email me or get on, like, it's really about people taking, having access to career development and not feeling it, regardless of where they are from a resource perspective. So there is, if people are interested in exploring those guides, I draw from the U.S. Department of Labor's Holland Codes, my next move, and I take some time to explain all those. So I won't go through them today, but I will highlight that if people want to explore more at the individual level, what their interests, motivations, values are. And I wanted to finish off a little bit today talking a bit about especially because that last section that guide will give you a ton of resources on how to get involved in environmental organizations as well. I'm not going to spend a ton of time reading that. But one thing I wanted to finish off with was sort of a discussion around long-term thinking. So long-term thinking, I really like this book by Roman Sarnik called The Good Ancestor. He talks a lot about the idea of, when he defines good long-term thinking, he's talking about centuries here. He's talking about trying to think past your own lifespan as far as what types of changes you want to see in the world. He talks a lot about evolutionarily, how like we were very developed to the people who could make, you know, when you hear a horn honk that you react right away. We have a lot of day-to-day advantages to making short-term decisions, but we don't necessarily spend a lot of time thinking beyond our lifespans. He's quick to point out this is not his idea. Many indigenous groups have been doing this for since time immemorial. You know, you have seventh generation thinking and stuff like that. But he argues that sometimes people get stressed out by sort of thinking in the medium term. I find of often like, what's the world going to be like in 10 years? And I sort of say, you know, even if we slam the brakes hard with climate change, even if you slam the brakes hard on a car, it still skids. So often I encourage people to look in the here and the now of what they can do. But I also try to get people to think a little bit more broadly about what is the world they want to live in beyond this. And there's some interesting examples of this from history. There's this thing called cathedral thinking, which was this idea that some of these cathedrals in Europe would take centuries to build, which is something that's kind of a hard concept to get our head around, where you'd have a stonemason working on a building that's like, my kid will finish this building, or my grandchild will finish building this building. That is not something that I will necessarily see. So often I think about kind of what is the world that I would like to exist, whether or not I'm around to see it. And the idea of seventh generation thinking, again, it gets you about 150 years out. The idea here is this sort of very anti-colonial sort of approach around avoiding enslaving future generations to the present. So the decisions we make now matter not just to our world now, but to the world of future generations. And I think that can sometimes give us not to depreciate the many challenges that we face today. And I also want to emphasize, again, Eugenie did a really fantastic job of highlighting all the developmental sort of challenges going on, but that there is also a future world out there, and we play a role in shaping, you know, a better world beyond what we see in the immediate present. I do have some exercises that can kind of take us through long-term thinking, but I kind of want to pause and see, George, in terms of time, were you wanting I know that normally it ends around 2 o'clock. Is that 1 o'clock your time? Is that correct?
Well, we did tell people ahead of time that we might go a little over, anticipating that the Q&A will take us past 1 o'clock, maybe even, you know, 10 after 1 max. So go ahead, Trevor.
I can do one more exercise. Okay. Yeah. Okay, one more exercise, then I'll stop talking until people ask questions, I promise. So one thing I like to do is sometimes this idea of long-term thinking, and I'm going to walk you through a little visualization exercise. This is going to get people thinking down the road, and this can be a little bit of an emotionally strong experience. So some people might feel more comfortable. If you don't want to, you're welcome to stretch your legs, replenish your caffeine resources. But I would encourage, if you're up for it, one thing I often get people to do is sometimes to think a little bit about visualizing a child they know, whether it's a grandchild or a child they have positive sentiments towards. And imagining that child growing to middle age and old age, and then holding their great grandchild in their arms. So if you can imagine that, you can keep your eyes open if you want. If you feel comfortable, you're welcome to close them. But then I want you to imagine they're holding their great grandchild at old age and they're looking out their window. What do you hope they see outside that window? And I'm going to ask people to write that down now. What do they hope that when they look out that window, when you know someone, the youngest person you can think of getting to a very old age, and holding their great grandchild, what do you hope they see? Again, I won't ask people to share this with others. This is for you to personally think about. So now I'm going to give you another 30 seconds. Write down just what are you looking outside that window? Now, what are you hoping that that child, when they're at old age, holding their great grandchild looking out the window, what do you hope that world looks like? And I'm going to ask you, as a final thing, if you had to write a letter to that child and saying one of these 3 sentences, a long-term project or the long-term projects that I did that I hope will extend beyond my lifetime were the legacy of hope I leave for you is, or in the years following the COVID pandemic, and notice that the 0 at the front is not a mistype. That's from the Long Now Foundation. They make a habit of always putting a 0 in front of the 2020 to emphasize the long-term spectrum of the human species and how that works. So try to finish one of those sentences. Again, this won't affect your GPA. I'm not going to get quiz people on this. In longer workshops that I run, sometimes we share, but I'm not going to put anyone on the spot today. But just think about one of those answers. There's no high score for answering all 3, but like one thing, if you were writing to that person, what would you like them to know you worked on? Or the legacy that you hope for them? Everyone, a couple minutes. One more minute. Okay. You can continue to work on this. I won't, again, this is something that's ongoing. But just to get us thinking about the world that we're hoping for, the world that we're building towards. I want to end today with a quote by Jerome Frank from Persuasion and Healing, one of my favorite books on psych and counseling. He says that no individual may have it within his or her power to overcome or expunge the malaises or misfortunes of society. But everyone has something important to contribute to the whole, and the radiating effects of that contribution are sometimes beyond calculation. Thanks for listening, everybody. If anyone has any thoughts, they're welcome to email me. I really appreciate your time and generosity in being here today on a busy Thursday.
There, I was muted. Well, thank you, Trevor. That was really very engaging, and I appreciate the detail and also quite a bit of referencing to materials that people hopefully followed. A recording of this will be posted on our website in case you want to go visit again to see the various titles that Trevor and Eugenie have mentioned as material that will help all of us to the extent that we want to help our younger students cope with the climate crisis. So with that, I'm going to remind people to put their questions in the chat, and Beth Abels will then read the questions and to either Eugenie or Trevor or both, and we can get our attendees today to participate in that way. So go ahead, Beth, and unmute yourself and go ahead and read anything that might be in the chat, or if you have questions, of course, put them in the chat. It's been quite active, actually, with people giving answers to some of the quizzes, the exercises. I really liked the one about what brings you joy and what would you tell a very, very infant person, or what would you hope they would see out the window. That one was my favorite one of the exercises. Some people said green, some people said a lot of plants. I said a lot of animals. Clear running water, lots of trees, clear blue skies. I think that one really did pique a lot of our interest and curiosity there. I'm not seeing anything in the chat quite yet, but I do see people putting stuff in the chat earlier before we opened it up to Q&A, and we have actually a bit of time. So be brave.
George, there was a question earlier. Maybe a little bit different than what we're talking about right now, but it was about competitions, if anybody knew of competitions that might be helpful for our students to stay motivated. So I wanted to check and let people know that if you know of competitions or you have ideas, please feel free to put them in the chat or to email myself or George, and we'll share them with Fatima. And then I'm just hearing, I think we have people who are feeling very relaxed and optimistic is what I'm seeing in the.
Well, I did have one question actually that I was hoping to put at the beginning, but I think right now is the appropriate time, because in both of your practices, you deal with other causes of anxiety that affects young people. And you, Trevor, you brought that up at the beginning. How does one look at a constellation, literally a tsunami of stimulus that is, we could say negative stimulus, and it's hard enough for an individual to sort out what is causing me different anxiety. But in your professional practice, how do you tease out of this constellation of stimuli what relates to climate, and therefore what can be addressed with all of the wonderful suggestions you've actually made? Is there a way that professionally that as an analyst you can isolate from the bundle what is related to environment and climate? And go ahead and unmute yourself. You might be muted. Both of you are muted.
Yeah. Rock, paper, scissors for Eugenie. Do you wanna, I think because mine's very career focused, it's a little bit different, or career or grief focused. I think there's not really a simple answer to that one. I myself, we don't do a lot of like questionnaires per se. It's more really just a discussion, and through that discussion really trying to pull apart. Sometimes the clients don't know either, right? Like it's sort of it's trying to figure out in what order is the things layered on top of each other. Though, Jeannie, you've had a lot, I think you treat a lot more anxiety like that area as well. You might have some other thoughts.
I sometimes ask people, when I first meet them, what are some of the challenges that you face in your life? And I kind of always have an eye, I guess, on the world events as in addition to the immediate things that they're dealing with. Sometimes it's study pressures or student pressures, but sometimes I think by asking that question, they do disclose, some of their concerns about the world and climate change. But sometimes it's just a matter of having that on my radar to be able to see if I can pull that out a little bit, because they may not just volunteer that information.
I guess I'd echo that as well. Like there is a bit of consciousness raising. One thing, I work with young people, 17, 18, and they're like, I just don't know what I'm going to do. And I was like, well, isn't it wild that at 18, like we have the societal belief that you should know who you're going to be when you're 40 or 50, that now that you finished high school, you're granted prescience. And I sometimes kind of have sort of kind of somewhat playfully, but trying to kind of be like, there's sort of these expectations of knowledge when you're still developing and everything. It kind of, if we ask 17-year-olds to know what they're going to do with their life, we're kind of throwing out everything we know about developmental psych. And the idea that, that it is an ongoing sort of experience and that people aren't the same people at 40 as they are at 18. And that's a good thing. So I often try to kind of explore sometimes around that. Sometimes you are right, Jeannie, that they might not know, and sometimes trying to probe or even bring up the topic can be useful to get people thinking about those things.
Mm-hmm. Well, that makes a lot of sense, because I realize that in the line of work you're doing, you're actually advising and counseling people in professional career choices they're going to make. And maybe in that context, it's people probably more willing to discuss at length what drives them, and then zero in on how can you relieve your anxiety about the future by becoming active. Well, I'm in an older age group, and the anxieties we had when we were younger had to do with mutually assured destruction, which was the Cold War nuclear missiles. And we had a little phrase, better active today than radioactive tomorrow.
Well, I often draw on the work of like Jay Lifton, doctor, he's a psychiatrist, and he worked a lot with clients who were affected by the nuclear blasts in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and had radiation poisoning. So kind of how they chose to live their life knowing that fact, right? I've worked with social workers before who did a lot of support groups in the 90s, the 80s, particularly the 80s, around kind of that the Cold War, right? And as you said, the MAD, like the mutual assured destruction. I think that sometimes highlighting historical events that have also been sort of existential in nature is very helpful. I do think one thing, though, that sometimes I push back on a little bit is when they talk about nuclear war. Often the students, or not students, sometimes clients conflate the two, and that like I often see nuclear war as kind of a light switch on, light switch off kind of problem. Like if it happens, everything immediately collapses. Whereas I see climate change as more of a crumbling and a stretching apart of social safety nets, in a way that on one hand is problematic, because if you start doing the right thing, it's not like it immediately is fixed, but it's also, it's this growing inequalities and gradual crumbling apart of social systems, as opposed to kind of, we wake up tomorrow, it's a ½ degree warmer and everyone grabs a club and runs out into the streets, Mad Max style. Like, and I'm even started, like, not to diminish the seriousness of it, because it is, but I think sometimes the way they're sort of the framing of it can help from inspire, kind of emphasizing that sense that, our actions are always and yet never too late.
Well, I've noticed that in the chat, Lucy Garcia shared something very important. She said, I would like to mention that I follow the patterns I see among the Indigenous and Black movements here in the US. These are people who have done so much more than weathering the storm. They've changed the fundamentals. First lesson, this is a generational work. Second lesson, we need all the talents. Third lesson, not everyone is an activist, but everyone makes our own culture. So thank you, Lucy. If you would like to address any of those, that she's saying there's a whole civil rights history in this country that we need to learn from, since it's generations of people that have been I guess she said more than weathering the storm, much more than weathering the storm.
Yeah, I'm always struck by, can people hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I'm always struck by how everyone is making culture. Not only their own culture, we're making the new culture together. And we have to address, one thing I didn't put in there is we have to address power. Not everybody is lined up to do that. But everybody can support those who are lined up to do that. You know, so you're building culture. No matter what you're doing, you're building culture. You know, the way you chain your dog up is building culture about nature, right? So everything that you're doing. I love that, starting with generational wealth. I like it because we have a wealth of things.
Yeah, and I should say I'm really glad you brought that up, Lucy. I'm from Manitoba, where particularly it's been really shameful how little we've really learned from Indigenous communities. And particularly within our sort of space, we've definitely had a lot of conversations around the existential threats they've been facing for centuries and centuries. And it's like they have those communities have a lot more knowledge and experience dealing with these seemingly, or these overwhelming challenges than many of us do. For sure.
I do have one more thing to add, and that is, you know, the idea that we can just do a little technological fix. That's not how we got in this mess, right? Climate change is another layer on top of all of the other destruction of the environment. And the destruction of the environment is linked to the destruction of people, relationships. It's linked to racism. It's linked to war and colonialism and so on. So we didn't get into this mess we didn't get into this mess by simply making, a mistake. We started burning fossil fuels. What a mistake. You know, we got into this mess through all of those other disregards of human life, of life in general. And so we're not going to get out of it without building a new culture about life.
I agree.
Which everybody's doing.
Yeah, well, there's a fundamental argument to be made that like really we're here because we treat some people like their lives matter more than others. One of the exercises I do from a career perspective is sometimes asking people why the latter. Like, you know, you can have jobs that are essential to society, but are paid differently, are treated differently. Like obviously in Canada, I can only reference my own country, but like in Canada, if I tell someone I'm a healthcare aide or I'm a waste management worker who helps keep us from having a cholera epidemic, or I tell someone I'm a doctor, they treat me differently. When it comes to cutting budgets, they cut one before the other, even though both are essential. So I think that's a fundamental valuing of a human being. So glad you brought that up, Lucy. So glad you brought that up. I was at pains to choose what to cut from presentations for today, but it is undeniably, and climate justice is not in no way separate from the climate crisis that we're experiencing or the emotionality we're experiencing. Yeah.
And well, Beth is asking if we should wrap it up, but I have one pending burning question I can't resist asking, because I bring this up with my students in my environmental science and environmental studies classes. And that is that when you look at the distribution of the consequences of the climate crisis, they're obviously very uneven on the global level and even on the local level. So for example, globally, some of the populations on the planet that are paying the highest price for climate change are the ones that have least contributed to the problem. They're not major producers of greenhouse gases. I'm thinking of, Pakistan was 30% of the country was underwater in a long flood a couple of years ago, and it destroyed towns, villages, hospitals, schools, cropland. I don't know if Pakistan has even begun to recover from that, but they produce less than 1% of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. More locally, and I think you could speak to this, Trevor, in Canada, the people paying a very high price right now for what we call global warming are the so-called circumarctic people that live very high up in latitudes. That's where the temperatures have really risen the most, and where ice is melting the fastest, where the landscape has changed the most radically, affecting all of those people that live off the land. And even in Los Angeles, when we looked at the heat island effect, even within our city, there's a huge difference between the tree-lined, suburban, nice houses that belong to wealthier people and the treeless, concrete, hot neighborhoods that working people live in, people of color live in, and they get all of the distress from heat. So how do we deal with the maldistribution of the bads from the point of view of climate activism? Give it any answer you want.
Oh, that's a big one. I think there's sort of also a tactical and then like a strategic level there. Yeah, you are right. Like Inuit peoples, northern sort of people have been deeply affected. There's a term called solastalgia, which is sort of the sense of homesickness when you're at home, but you know the ice sheets are no longer there. We've had and the water no longer runs and stuff like that. And I think that from an activist standpoint, I mean, that's a little bit outside of my area of expertise. But I think for me, from a career perspective, often I look to the lessons of organized labor. I think the strategies unions used to put to achieve aims can be utilized in a variety of settings. I know in Canada we have a little bit of a different relationship to unions maybe than in the US, but I've always found Jane McKelvey's work particularly inspiring.
Oh, thank you. That is yes, as a member of a union myself, I know how important being.
Yeah, like I'm not saying that they don't certainly have their own challenges and their own growth points to work on, but like in terms of just the raw sitting down of like, we need these things to create a more greater dignity in our lives and a greater redistribution and social support of human lives, and people don't want to do it. How do we can make movement towards that justice? That's one that I've drawn from, but I'm sure there are many others. I know that again, there's a lot of talk of in Canada drawing from Indigenous resistance movements that often, unfortunately, bear the brunt of trying to stop pipelines and stuff like that more than, and again, it's to your point of often the people with the least office of it often having to end up doing the most is tragic.
Well, thank you, Trevor. And Eugenie, if there's anything you'd like to part with, that would be, you did bring this up, actually Lucy did as well in her chat, about the importance of Indigenous and civil rights movements in taking lessons that we can apply. But really do appreciate today's discussion. I think it's been very constructive for everyone attending. And I want to thank you. And thank you also, Lucy, for taking part today. But Eugenie and Trevor, thank you for really leading us through a very enlightening and hopefully a educational experience, so that now people will have even more resources to learn about how to deal with our students' crisis and perhaps even our own. So with that, I'm going to stop the recording. Voila, it will be available on